Let's come to our presentation. This is actually the 17th of our year, and there will be 52. And so we're gaining now that first third, and the ancient way to hunt with a spear, or to play the Olympics in the original with throwing a javelin, is to grab it 2/3 back from the point, 1/3 from the end, for the power thrust. And so we're going to do a little power thrust today, this week. We're looking at a way which is stronger than a renaissance, more lasting than a reformation, more changing than a revolution. We're looking at a recalibration of civilization. The way in which an analytic of time has influenced civilization goes back to the beginnings of literacy on a level where there was at least a seed community of men and women who could read and write. This generation is classically enshrined in the beginnings of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, with Adam and Eve. And it was the good Bishop Ussher in Ireland who computed some 100 years ago that if you take all of the dates in the book of Genesis for years and so forth, one traces Adam and Eve back to 4004 BC, which is extraordinary because it is very close to the actual time. Let's say 4000 BC. The myth that Adam and Eve have eaten an apple out of the tree of discrimination between good and evil and are therefore exiled from Eden before they can eat from the fruit of the tree of life is completely a distorted myth, as most myths that are ancient are. We have, in our time, in the early 21st century, been progressively aware for the last several centuries, 3 centuries almost, that we have to extricate ourselves from flawed myths. It isn't that myths and mythology itself is suspect, but that it has been manipulated in civilization to where the mythic quality of experience, the oral telling of stories, of relationships between nature and the divine and supernatural and man, which had and still do have a legitimacy in cultures, have suffered greatly from the truncations, the distortions, the deceptions of civilization, so that the mythic horizon, which in nature is a great part of the maturation of a developing species of intelligence, when it comes to the ability to power up the access of integral comprehension by a symbolic structure in our mentality, what suffers most of all is the distortion of a culture's mythic horizon, so that one begins to have more and more what we suffered through in the 20th century, and that is the state empire's manipulation of myth. And in consequence, because myth is extremely powerful in its expression, not only as mythology in a culture, but as art in a civilization. The state took over both in Nazi Germany, in Soviet Russia, in military Japan, and everywhere like the Roman Empire and many other empires, so that art was co-opted at the same time that the cultural mythology was distorted. We're looking at a massive recalibration, which has barely begun its harvest. But the preparation has been long, and so these presentations are a harvesting. And it is an ancient tradition that the first fruits of a harvest be offered in thanks for the ability to have understood how we live now in a more sophisticated way. Not by hunting and gathering, not by willy-nilly planting, not by chance taming, and certainly not limited anymore to a precious few coterie who manufacture for themselves a commandeering of the literate capacity to read and write freely. When I first began in the early 1980s, that's almost 35 years ago, to explore this technique, I had already spent several decades at the university level. And so the material that originally came out was in the form of essays that were almost classic in their presentation. And in the third volume of what eventually will be the set of Jesus in Alexandria and Mary Magdalene, Our Origins of Shared Presence, that third volume will be all of the appendices brought up to date, brought up to roughly 2015 when they will come out. The first two of those appendices, number one, the origin, is Pythagorean cosmos communities. K on cosmos, because the Greek is very much a special use of the term, which the Latin cosmos with a C doesn't actually cover adequately. Pythagoras was both a scientist and traditionally called also a mystic, but the quality that is mystic to those who understood that he was a mathematician is that he was a musician who was able to understand the principles of composition and was the first to be able to make the correlation between mathematics and music. And this is the opening paragraph of the opening appendix written in the early 1980s. This material concerning Pythagoras and Pythagorean cosmos communities is very difficult to hear about without prejudice, and even more difficult to read about without preconceptions. The myth and the symbols become progressively more distorting, more deceptive, more impenetrable. This actually provides us with exactly the kinds of challenges of prejudice and preconception concerning Jesus and Mary Magdalene, not to mention Jesus and Mary Magdalene as originating shared presence tuning pairs. The second of the appendices is on the teacher of righteousness. And the first paragraph reads, the Hebrew phrase which translates as the teacher of righteousness is Morach HaSedek. Parallel to this is the phrase Messiah HaSedek, which translates into the Messiah of righteousness. The teacher comes first, then in sequential parallel, the Messiah. The teacher begins, the Messiah culminates. The teacher sets the pattern of seeking, gathers the congregation, and points out the vision. The Messiah completes the pattern of seeking, confirms the congregation in its final form, and perfects the vision. He makes it all true. We have been looking at the teacher of righteousness, and now we're going to change his name. It is better to call him the teacher of wisdom vision. The reason for this is that the two outstanding books by him that dominate the culmination of what is called the Old Testament, the original Bible, the book of Job and the book of Daniel, and they are both by him, written by him. Written, in fact, in such a way that there is a half century in between them. He was a young, sophisticated Alexandrian Jew, probably third generation from those translators brought to Alexandria to translate the sacred Hebrew writings into Greek. And there were, on invitation from the first Ptolemy, to be 6 from each of the 12 tribes, making 72, and preparations were to be made where on the island where the great lighthouse of Pharos was located, they would be given a small enclave where they and their families could live and to set up so that this would be a special translating village, a community, if you will. And it was culminated by Ptolemy's second, Philadelphus, by making sure that all the preparations were ready. And it was at this time that the Jewish community of Alexandria, which was always there from the planning, from the beginnings. One has to understand this about Alexander the Great. It was his vision that there be, in Greek, an oikumene, in Latin, an ecumene, that all of mankind be seen, be visionable, be beholdable as a family, the family of man. And in order to do this, there needed to be a new thread to bring together all of the beads of the various cultures, all of the gems of the various civilizations into a necklace, and it needed to have a thread that could go through all of them. And this thread was twofold. It had to be a thread which had a practique application. It had to be able to reach out to the actual political economy, as we would say today, of all of the cultures, of all of the nascent experiments with civilization, and bring them all together into this necklace. That same thread would have to have the experience of very long, almost world trading routes. And the original long trading route that was known at that time was the trading route developed by Sargon of Akkad, the North Semitic peoples that came together with Sargon, who ruled for 56 years in Akkad, who was able to knit together, first of all, the 42 different city-state, 42 different temples of Sumerian mythology and background into a unity which then was called Akkad, the Akkadian Empire, aided by his daughter Enheduanna, who was able to give the second part of that. Not only a trading route that spanned, at the time, Sargon's trading route went from Cyprus in the Mediterranean Sea to the Indus River civilization bordering on the Ganges River and the northern Himalayas, the Hindu Kush. And so one had this enormous swath 4,400 years ago. It was the Semitic, northern Semitic peoples who did this. They also developed a quality of language that increasingly utilized the cuneiform writing that was able to interface with other forms of writing, some of them still not translatable. The Indus River, it's because of one of the great cities there, Harappa. The other one was Mohenjo-Daro. The Harappan civilization had pictographs, petroglyphs, like hieroglyphs, like early Chinese, which have not still not been able to be translated. The quality of being able to write so that one could read was opening the portals of the access to vision, to a field of vision, wherein one could do a transform of the mentality of symbolic structures, at the same time reach down and encourage and tease out and bring back to life the mythic horizon of a whole variety of cultures, so that one then had the essence, as it were, of the various kinds of beginnings of civilization and the great spread and splendor of the mythic horizon of all cultures that one would come into contact with. And with those two, one could reach back and be able to bring new, recalibrated ritual bases into play. And all of this would refresh not only the well of reaching down to Mother Nature's field, original field, but reaching up to Father transforms conscious field of vision. And to bring this together, Enheduanna is the world's first great writer of personal name that we know of. Yes, there were some beginnings of writing, but it is with Enheduanna that the other aspect of Sargon's Akkadian empire, that civilization that had the trading routes, now also had the ability to have a literate language that was readable across the entire swath and scalar of these trading routes, so that there then again was the ability for that recalibration to have new centers of quality. One of the centers was the interface between Mesopotamia and India, and that center was in northern Iran. The other center was in between the Mesopotamia again of Akkad and the Mediterranean island communities and coastal communities. And within sight of Cyprus, there was a peninsula, a spit of land coming out from the East Mediterranean coast, which is today in Syria. And that coast was called, in ancient times, Ras Shamra. It means it is the point of fennel. Wild fennel was cultivated, and you had that as one of the crops there. And from Ras Shamra, within sight not only of Cyprus, but the further reach into the Mediterranean, all the way to Rhodes, to Crete, to those islands of the Aegean. And of course, following the islands went up all the way to Samos, Samothrace, and the northern coast of Thrace, and the farther coast that led into the Black Sea. It was at Ras Shamra, at a city called Ugarit, that alphabetical language was first developed there, and it was in northern, what was the ancient Irani area, in what is today Kabul in Afghanistan, that the other development of alphabetical language happened, and they were tuned. So that the place that is called Antioch and the place that is called Kabul were the twin tuning forks of the way in which an alphabetical language came into play. And that was 2,000 years after Adam and Eve in 2000 BC. And the archetypal way in which that is deposited in the time forms of civilization that by that time, by 2000 BC, were not only beginning to gel, but that one had the experience of a tremendous renaissance some 500 years before that, about 2500 BC, where not only was the building techniques in Egypt able finally to build the Great Pyramids, but the building techniques in the farther reaches already of civilization in its swath, all the way to the British and Irish Isles off the continent that became Europe. One had the great perfection of architectural beginnings that went all the way back to about 3200 BC. By 2500 BC, they were refined enough to have two great places, the Boyne River in Ireland and the Salisbury Plain in the west of Britain, where at the Salisbury Plain, Stonehenge was finalized by having the great trilithons, the blue stones, mined in Wales and brought all the way there through great travail and engineering and architectural genius. And to have Stonehenge as the great jewel of a whole pattern of communities, centers in the Salisbury Plain, reaching all the way back to Ireland, where there was a great community around Newgrange, which is about 3200 BC, and with Noath and Dowth, you had a triangle, a triumvirate, and in that Boyne River, these three were matched together as a great equilateral triangle in Ireland, with the three in the Giza Plateau of Egypt, those three stars are the belt of Orion, those three great pyramids, and those three in Newgrange, Noath, and Dowth, Ireland, are the great equilateral triangle that is related to them. That equilateral triangle is Sirius for Osiris, Sirius, Procyon, they called Sirius the dog star. This is before the dog star, Procyon, and Betelgeuse, if you like, Betelgeuse from the Arabic, a great yellow star in Orion, so that the ancient Celtic and the ancient Egyptian have an interface. They have an interface between Orion and this great equilateral triangle at the same time. In Mesopotamia, by this time, a great development had happened at Ur. And Ur, in the south of that Akkadian Sumerian, the trading route center was called the Fertile Crescent because it went from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. But that was only the beginnings of like an Isis moon of a whole cycle of understanding. And there, one began to find a vision which was characteristically a culmination of an ionic carrier wave, of a 2,000-year carrier wave, reaching back 2,000 years to 4,000 BC, when the literate language was first large enough to have a population characterized by Adam and Eve, who could read and write, who were not at all thrown out of Eden or exiled from Eden, but who walked out because they could no longer remain in that simple, natural garden, and they went out to explore, like Sargon's great trading routes, went out to explore what else is there that we can find and adventure to, and eventually inhabit, and eventually expand and refine, and so forth. And so it is not an exile from Eden, it is the beginnings, the trigger of what led 2,000 years later to the great vision of Abraham that there was a new promised land, and that this new promised land was going to be fertile specifically for growing the crop, if you will, the population, if you must understand, of those being able to access vision beyond just reading and writing, of being able to not only enter into vision through reading and writing, through a written language, but to carry the quality of prismatic person that came out of this and reach the next phase where one would be able to have a kaleidoscopic consciousness of history. And by developing a kaleidoscopic consciousness that took the differential consciousness of vision and gave it yet another dimension, not only a quintessential fifth dimension of vision, making a prismatic person sixth dimension of art, but those who were artists in becoming not only making works of art, but their person became a work of art. They became prismatic, capable of having a jewel-like quality, which kaleidoscopic history is actually the dimension that comes into play as a seventh dimension. And so Abraham with Sarai, later when she would have a child, her name became Sarah. They gathered those few relatives and persons in their entourage and went in quest of the promised land. They knew roughly where it would be, and they went to find exactly where the beginning would be. And the beginning, the first time that a piece of land was purchased by Abraham, was a cave called the Cave of Machpelah, which is still there. It's in Hebron, up on the high ridge. It's where Abraham and Sarah are buried. It's where their son Isaac and his wife Rebekah are buried. They are still there. The tombs are still there. This is all true. The quality of the way in which dimensions of civilization gel increasingly, clearly, powerfully, expansively in the way in which civilization recalibrates itself again and again, refining out to, in our time, with a new carrier wave, with a very clear, very vast vision. Our field of the universe is now 14 billion years, light years, and counting. We're going adventuring on a scalar that is not even imaginable except to a small community of people through the ages, as it were, but who began to cluster about 100 or so years ago into what we gave here at this chair 52 presentations under the aegis of the science fiction vision. That science fiction vision now is fruitful in the grandchildren's generation. It is out of the history, the kaleidoscopic history, that comes the refinement of science. Science itself emerging. There was really no science to speak of until Pythagoras. Someone at JPL told me one time, we're all Pythagoreans. We understand. We still have concerts. We still do our math. We increase the refinement of the math every month, every year. And we increase our ability to appreciate the music, the architecture, the qualities that are there. And we're not only going to go, we are going. Further, faster, but more real. We're going to take a little break and come back. The teacher of righteousness, the teacher of vision, wisdom, the vision in the book of Job that the divine is real. For us, there is an access. And the wisdom is not plannable, but doable in terms of preparation over long periods of time. In the book of Daniel, it was going to be 490 years. 7 times 7, tenfold. The ancient quality of harvesting was that every 7 Sabbaths, every 49 days, there was a 50th day, which was a jubilee. And that jubilee was the festival of first fruits. And during the cycle of a year, there would be 7 jubilees. 7 times 50, which gives you 350 days in that year, with 2 sevens plus its special jubilee. That 15 days added to the 350 gives you the annual solar calendar of 365 days and a quarter, because in that special 15th day, after the 14, there's always a furthering that is included, so that the integral is not stopped at completeness, but continues on to perfection. Let's take a break.